So, hey everyone, welcome back to my channel, Side Hustle Seattle. So, one of the things I'm trying for this year is to expose you to different side hustles from people I either know or people that I've seen in the industry. And one of the things that I've seen people do that I've always been super curious about are long-term rentals. And I actually have somebody who I know through college who does long-term rentals, and I wanted to get him on here to talk about how that experience has been like for him. And I wanted somebody who truly does do it from the side. He has his own 9 to 5, and this is something he kind of does from the side to help, supplement or just, get additional income. So I'm going to be introducing Quincy. Quincy, first of all, thank you so much for talking to me, being here, taking time out of your busy work day. Just appreciate that.
Of course, I'm glad I was even asked to be on here, right? And talk about rentals. I love talking about it.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's something that me and my husband have always thought about potentially doing. So I'm definitely curious to hear kind of what your journey's been like. So we'll just kick off from there. What of all the things that you can do on the side, why long term rentals? Especially why long term rentals and not like short term rentals?
So in real estate, there's so many different strategies. And so long-term rentals for me was something that was steady income, not turnover of different tenants. So I think it was easier for me to jump into long-term rentals than the short-term thing. Because I think the the upstart for short-term rentals is like, where am I buying the furniture? Where am I getting all of this to furnish the entire unit? How am I sourcing different people to actually stay? In Chicago, you need to have a specific credential to even do short term. So there were a lot more barriers than doing long term, which was easier finding a tenant, signing a lease, get them in there for 12 months minimum. So yeah, that's how I kicked it off for long term
For,
rentals over short term.
so how long? Why long term rentals in the first place? Like why that over maybe some other different strategies for growing wealth?
So I think for me, it was when I figured out from the counterparts that were wealthy in our America that are the 1%, real estate is always in that equation. And so I'm like, okay, well, as somebody who comes from nothing, let me go ahead and take what they were doing and apply it to my own life. And so that was one reason, but also because real estate has always been around and it's helped create generational wealth. So it's not just something that you can use today, it's something that you can also pass down to your family and something that can also help them keep income coming into the house, right? And
Yeah.
so creating that generational wealth of what other people have done who are in that 1% was like a no brainer for me. I just had to figure it out because I was never raised around somebody doing real estate at all.
Yeah, absolutely. And how, so kind of to that, like you said, you weren't raised around like somebody who did real estate. How do you go about like choosing your properties? Like how do you kind of figure that out?
So I have a couple things that I put into mind. One is
Yeah.
location. So when you think about where do you actually want to do real estate, location has to be one of the top things to think about. I never wanted to do, or in this phase of my life, I didn't want to do rentals that were out of my state. And so for me, it was being in Chicago right now. I said, hey, it's something in my backyard. I know different neighborhoods. I've lived here for a good
Mm-hmm.
amount of time. And I came to Chicago with the intent to do real estate. And so finding properties was one, what neighborhoods are up and coming? For me, it's about neighborhoods that are up and coming. And so is the city putting out development plans for those neighborhoods so you know money is being injected into those neighborhoods over a certain period of time, right? So that's one thing. The other piece is what is a major attraction for that neighborhood? I like schools. So as somebody who used to work in higher education, I like
Yeah.
universities. I like hospitals. I like huge parks. So there's some parks out here within the city that are acres. And so people who can live in one of the biggest cities in the United States, but also be close to some nature of some sorts, is super attractive. And then another thing is it safe? I think
Yeah.
oftentimes people have this misunderstanding of Chicago to some extent of like everything's unsafe. Don't get me wrong. Chicago got some stuff going on. We all know the facts are out there. like, but honestly, it's like, where do I want to stay? Because part of my strategy is also doing primary residence. So I live in every place that I purchased. That way, I get a better rate, better return on investment, and things like that that are part of my overarching strategy for investment.
Okay, wait. So hold up. So when you purchase a location, you also lived there for a period of time prior to renting it out. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. So part of my flow is being able to. So with primary residence, you get a better interest rate and you get a
Mm.
lower down payment. So either if you use FHA, VA
Mm-hmm.
loan, they have a conventional 5% down for primary residence. So I just went through the flow of using FHA, which is a 3.5% down. And then I
Wow.
use the VA since I'm prior military. And then my next one is to
I
use a
didn't know.
conventional 5.5%. So for me, it's like, and that's why when you ask me about criteria where I choose to buy
Uh
properties,
huh.
some of those have to be like non-negotiables. Because I'm
Yeah.
like, one, if I'm living there, I don't want to be walking outside of my house and I'm like, the cops are running by or it's a drive by, different things going on. And so safety and things like that were part of that equation because I am living in these locations for a certain amount of time. And to answer your question directly, a minimum of a year. The programs require a minimum of a year for you to be staying in the house before you can move elsewhere.
Nice. Okay, so a couple follow ups for that. So one of my questions was going to be how many properties do you have? Like, what's the ideal number of like places? Are you like, okay, I only want five? Is it ever growing? You give a year and this the next, the next, the next. Like, what does that look like?
So essentially, it's more of like a numbers game for me. So how can I
Mm-hmm.
take my 9 to 5 salary and replace it through somewhat passive income of real estate investing, right? So
Yeah.
that, in a sense, is what people call financial freedom. I have no need for a 9 to 5 job because I have something that's making money for me to be living my life, right? So it's really a numbers game for me. And right now, I have three buildings, three buildings, but 12 doors because
Oh.
I focus on properties that are 3 to 4 unit multifamily properties because
Oh.
they're easier to manage in a one-stop shop versus me having 12 different houses across the city. I'm like that would be a lot. And also because I manage them on my own
Yeah.
for most of the part. And so that's like I need to be more efficient with my time and how I'm approaching my strategy so I can actually, get top
Wow.
dollar for what I'm doing.
Yeah, I was going to touch on that, and we'll touch on it a little bit later, like the landlord maintenance kind of piece of it. But I wanted to ask you: do you do fixer uppers, or is it turnkey? Like, what does that kind of look like when you get a property to like, okay, it's time to rent it out?
So I've traditionally done more turnkey with the caveat that if it needs some cosmetic work, I'm down to do that. So meaning like if it needs some painting, if the cabinets need to be painted, the baseboards need to be done, the floors need to be resanded, I'm down for that, right? Because that's something that is not attractive to some buyers, but I'm like, hey, I know how to do most of it, or I got a contact who can do it. So for me, it's mostly turnkey. The problem that I'm running into, or not a problem, but a shift that I want to run into or get into more so is like fixing things up because value add comes from, say, you have a 3 unit building above ground. So, meaning that you see three different levels, right? And then it has an attic on top of that and then a unfinished basement. That's a lot of potential for value add. So on the market, they can sell it for a finished 3 unit building. But if you go in there and renovate it and you add a unit in the attic, or you duplex the top floor to the attic, that's more space, more bedrooms. If you duplex the first floor to the basement and you finish it, that's more space, that's more bedrooms. Ultimately, that's more income too, right? And
Yeah.
so the property value goes up from things that you can add value to. So I want to get more into that, especially with the market right now. It's not too attractive for an outright purchase because of
Uh huh.
interest rates and just high cost of purchase, and specifically in Chicago too. There are other areas where I can go to that may not fit my criteria of safety or of other things that I was speaking to. But where I invest into, it's a little harder based on the numbers actually making sense.
Wow. Okay. No, I like that. And when you get since you're getting multi-unit buildings, are there already tenants in them, or you get them with nobody in it, and then you get renters, or do you like to get buildings that are already have renters in them?
So I would prefer buildings that have renters in them already. That's easier to some extent, but it's
Yeah.
also horror stories. So I've
Yeah.
I've gotten all my buildings. I've gotten renters in them, but since I'm using them as a primary residence, at least one unit has to be open for me to move into. right?
Yeah, yeah,
But so I like to go through a transaction where the income is still coming, right? But the thing you often run into is like people who've been staying there for 5 to 10 years and they get a new landlord, they know stuff is going to change. They know the rules and regulations. They know you've been smoking in the house for 5 years. You can no longer do like is they know things are going to change. And so that has presented some issues in previous properties that I purchased, such as evictions or people
yeah,
still people being on Section 8 and not following guidelines. There may be one person on Section 8 and then their spouse actually lives with them and that's not like there's so many things you come into that you don't know until you
yeah.
take over the building because the seller's not going to disclose all of that. Right? They're not gonna be like, yeah, so I got this tenant on the first floor that's Section 8, but her partner's been living there for 6 years. But they pay rent, they pay rent. So it's like there's certain things you won't find out until you purchase the building.
That's crazy. It's yeah, honestly, it's you have a very like high tolerance for risk, right? Like I think the biggest thing is a lot of people get nervous just to buy a house for themselves that they plan to live in because there's a lot of
Mhm.
it's very permanent. It feels very risky. Like we recently bought this house and I was like my heart, like, it's like pounding. But the fact that you're buying like a bunch of places that have tenants that have a bunch of like uncertainty, that's intense. And I wanted to know, how do you screen tenants? So like let's say somebody does move out. What does that criteria look like for screening the next one?
So for me, it's about a couple things. I one like to approach people from a holistic standpoint. I understand, especially being in Chicago and just life, people go through things. So my general guidelines may be, hey, I need a 600 credit score. I need you to make 2 times the rent, no evictions. But I know for a fact all my tenants that I have at least teetered on one of those criteria elements, right? In some kind of form where I've had to have follow-ups. I just rented a recent unit where the two tenants who wanted to live in the unit, one was a dog walker, one was a vocal coach, and they didn't have a consistent income, right? That's a flag. That's a flag of like, I don't know about this because COVID hit and people act like they didn't have no money, and then mortgage still was needed to be paid. Like anything could happen, right?
Yeah,
But they
yeah.
had a co-signer, and the co-signer was one of the applicant's mothers who made over 10,000 a month, right? And so I looked up the co-signer, looked legit, was like a big person at a company, a high senior level exec. And I'm like, okay, worst case scenario, they're on the lease, so
Yeah.
you know what I mean. I let it happen. So I'm like, I feel like they'll pay the bills, so or at least
Yeah.
have somebody else who could. So it's
Exactly.
things like that where I'm like, I look at the whole application because somebody always has some type of story. Again, the other part of that is be very Chicago's interesting, right? So I have had applicants who have just had fake applications, meaning they have fake
Really.
pay stubs. The contacts for their employer was like their friend who would be on the phone acting like they were the manager. Like I'm legit. Chicago has some things going on where you have to be diligent. You have to do your due diligence of who you
Yeah.
are renting to. It's not just about the numbers. That's why part of my experience is I meet people. You can't have a I'll leave it there. I meet people because I need to know who is coming to stay in the house because for these properties I'm living in, I need to be very clear of who's going to be living within it. So yeah,
Yeah. Wow, that's man. I can only imagine what people try to get away with, and I'm sure like some people are probably really good at faking documents, and some people it's probably so bootleg, and you're like, come on, man, like you could have spell checked
yeah,
this to like do all that. Uh,
exactly.
so you had touched on the fact that you maintain all your properties, and to me, I'm like trying to figure out how many hours you have in a day because you have a 9 to 5, and then you're managing properties and you're doing all this stuff. But how do you like handle maintenance and upkeep and like tenant complaints? Like, do you have like a system for that? Do you outsource any part of that?
Yes. So in the beginning, it was manual. It was like Gmail all day, every day, and then Zelle for payments. But it was not. It was not organized or structured. And what's ironic is my day job is I'm a project manager at a tech company. So I need to be organized and have infrastructure in place. And so I think maybe about 2 years ago, I ended up connecting with this vendor called Buildium. And so they can make payments through there. The late fees are automatic. the transaction go through there. They could communicate if there's a maintenance issue. I can update maintenance tickets and put information in notes. It has everything that I literally wrote a list and was like, what do I need in a project management software? Because this manual stuff is not efficient.
Yeah.
So like the first couple of years was hard of just keeping track because even with 5 units or 6 units, it was like relationships are all over the place, right? This tenant may be moving out. This tenant may want to have a conversation. This tenant may need a refrigerator change. And so tracking that manually was like a nightmare. And so since using this building software, it has been efficient. I just use one software to track everything. I have a dashboard that gives me the updates on when tenants are moving out, who's paid
Yeah.
rent, what email notices have been automated. And so like I need that. That has been super helpful for me. And what I've noticed that people who do property management for a living, sometimes they don't even have a software in place. They just do it manually. And I'm like,
That
I
sounds
know for a
terrible.
fact that's not efficient, and you are doing so.
Yeah.
I'm like, I know what I'm looking for, and I know what I could do on my own. So
Yeah.
like, it's definitely a job within itself, but the infrastructure has helped it be better.
Nice. I feel like you're probably like one of the better user profiles for somebody who can do like property management or long term rentals because you are a project manager. So like you can organize chaos and like make it structured in a way that probably people who don't do that on a day to day can't. But what would you say is like the biggest challenge you face when it comes to long term rentals? You're like, this is the number one thing where it's like this needs a fix.
The biggest challenge, that is a good question. I would say the biggest challenge. One, you may meet someone um, who checks all the boxes for renting from you, right? And then so it's a challenge in two ways. One, if I inherit a tenant who I need to eventually evict because they just think the policies or the procedures that the previous landlord ran with or allowed them to do is okay.
Yeah.
So I've done that. So I've already had an eviction in the couple of years that I've owned properties. Um, and then the other challenge would be to what would I call out? I would say the income. So
Yeah.
versus if I just put something out there, the income of long term income versus short term rentals. So short term rentals, if you're doing like Airbnb and they're in and out in like a month or a couple of weeks, you can make top dollar. Like you can almost in some areas double the money you would get for rent versus short term rentals. And so that has been a challenge because as interest rates go up, making the numbers work for what rental income I can get from these properties has to be a little bit more strategic. It can no longer be, can I get market rent and then that's going to pay the mortgage and give me cash flow. It has to be 2 units have to be Airbnb short term, 2 units have to be long term, and you have to really make it work. Or you may rent by room because you're close to the university, so your strategy has to be a little different and a little bit more creative. And so I would say that's becoming a challenge. So I can still buy more properties, but buy them in a way that the numbers make sense, and I'm not just buying something that's going to be a loss.
Yeah, that's exactly. Actually, you segued well into my next question, which is how do you set the price? Like, do you look at the market as a whole and you're like, okay, this is what they're charging elsewhere. Maybe I'm gonna go a little bit less, maybe a little bit more, maybe like how do you kind of play with those numbers? And then also, I would say, how do you balance kind of like the morality of it, right? Because like you said, you have people living there, right? You always hate when you're like renewing your lease at an apartment and you're like $300 more. Like, how do you kind of balance making sure you don't have a loss, but also just understanding that like people need a break sometimes.
That is a good question. It's a it's a varied approach. So,
Yeah.
as somebody who used to work in higher education and somebody who does diversity work as a day job, I'm like, it's a it's a mix between what is the moral approach to rental income versus just pay the rent. This is market. Are you paying or not? So I'm honest. You gotta be honest. And so on one side, on what's the market, it's like for me, if it's just somebody I'm renting to and it's a brand new open unit, I'm doing market rents. This is what the market is because that's what they're going to come in contact with if they
Yeah.
search around. So I'm trying to get top dollar just like everyone else is. Again, if it's also if my unit is on par with the high end or a high end unit, right? So it's
Yeah.
comparative. So that's another way. Another way is if I'm renewing a tenant, if it's a tenant that I really want to keep, and I'm like, you have not called me in a year. You take
Yeah.
care of everything. I will. Don't get me wrong. Mortgage and taxes and certain things will go up every year.
Yeah.
Uh, so I can't get away from that. But
Yeah.
I can give you a rent increase of $20 versus a $55 or $75 rent increase, right? And
Exactly. Yeah.
so and so I would rather give them a incentive to stay because turnover, nobody wants turnover. And so that is a way that I keep tenants coming back for, it's easier it's easier to increase your rent by $20 than to say I need to get movers and pay thousands of dollars to go somewhere else where I'm gonna pay a $50 difference. You know what I mean? I understand
Exactly.
that. And so I do try to work with tenants who I do want to keep in the units. So I would say those are two approaches on that side of just numbers. I think from a morale standpoint, we so I didn't say this, but one of my buildings I purchased with a business partner. It was one of our first buildings. It's a 3 unit, and so for a long time we didn't know, but we had a lot of single mothers renting in the area because it was close to a school.
Mm.
So we were given leeway on rental payments and timelines, but then when the renewal came up, I had to really talk to my business partner because he's a lawyer, right? So his mind is like, pay the rent or no. If you can't
Yeah.
afford it, then we can find somebody else. Me, I'm like, this is a single mother. She is from a marginalized background. Like, this is a gentrifying neighborhood. So there's a lot of things that come into play of me trying to navigate between the dollar amount and the actual livelihood of people that we are trying to rent to. So that has come up a couple times within our interactions of renting to certain people and at certain properties. Because our
Yeah.
properties are in different neighborhoods that have different types of renters and just experience. So yeah.
Yeah. No, that's a lot to balance. And I was gonna ask you, like, yeah, how do you approach kind of those relationships with tenants and the communication? Just in general, are you very like proactive with communication? Or are you like, if you don't bother me, like I won't bother you? Like, what? How do you kind of approach those relationships?
It depends. I'm proactive when it comes to like general maintenance that needs to be done, and
Hmm.
so if we need to change their air filters, instead of giving them the air filter, we'll come in twice a month or every 2 months and come change it. Right? It gives us the opportunity to talk with the tenant, assess what's going on. Are they beating out the walls, or you know what I mean? And so sometimes you just need to do that. That's a normal check-in. When it comes to general communication, if there's nothing going on, then I don't need to reach out. Like we at least have that 2 month cadence of connecting with the tenants and at least seeing them, so that works for us. And then they know that if something is an emergency, reach out immediately.
Yeah.
So we primarily focus on. There's three modes of communication that we primarily use. Email is probably the most used because it's a general notice. We're giving you information that you just need to read. The other is text messaging. So if it's something that's immediate, like that's happening now, like we have your refrigerator getting delivered, please open the back gate. A text
Mm.
message, right? If a water line broke and is spilling into the second floor, call us. So we have three main modes of communication, and the tenants know respond within 24 hours. No matter what's going on, we need a response in 24 hours if it warrants it, right? So we do have that clarity with our tenants of how to get in contact with us and how to make sure we're informed of different things and vice versa.
Yeah. No, I love that. And of course, I have to get to the question I know everybody wants to know. Let's talk numbers, right? So obviously, you have like the cost of the building and everything else, and you need to like take care of the mortgage. Outside of that, like what is kind of the take home? You can give broad numbers.
So I'll go property by property. So with one that I bought with my business partner, we take home probably about 500 cash flow. And so that's after the mortgage is paid, after putting a percentage aside for vacancies, capital expenditures, um, and just other things and utilities. So
Yeah.
we're taking about 500 home. And so that's one. The one that I purchased that is 4 units, I take about 1,000 home from that one because, but again, there's subtle differences. So with
Yeah.
that one, it's a phenomenal cash flow because I got it with my VA loan. So I didn't have to put money down. I actually went to the table and got a refund from the seller. My interest rate was when interest rates were crazy low,
Yeah.
and it was 4 units. And so being able to 4 units in that neighborhood, I'm making, 1350 from a 1 bedroom, 1900 from a 3 bedroom, and so it starts to add up with my mortgage and interest rate being so low in that neighborhood.
Yeah.
Um, with the one that I'm in right now, it would probably be, I wouldn't be cash flowing. And the
Okay.
reason I say that, because cash is not always the main focus. In the neighborhood I'm in now, so I'm 4 blocks from the Obama's house.
Oh.
The reason I call that out is because you know how you go somewhere and they say don't go across the train tracks. So
Yeah.
there's a road in between me and the Obama's house that's like on this side, there's a little crime. There's some stuff going on where you might get the alert that hey, there was a gunshot down the street or something like that, literally. And then on their side, it's literally like, and I'm talking about 4 blocks away. So
Yeah.
on their side, the mansions, the police cars when the Obamas come, like I can literally see all that just walking 4 blocks that way. And
Wow.
so the reason this one is okay of not cash flowing is because I know the location is going to eventually appreciate faster than locations where I'm just renting. And I'm also I'm within a mile of Chicago University's hospital, their campus, the Obamas. There's a new outpatient center that's built 1 block away from me. And so that development was a multi-million-dollar development. And so it doesn't always have to come back to the numbers. You also have to figure out what do you want out of this. And since long-term rentals is my goal, I'm like, I'll hold this. So
Yeah.
the first few years, it may not be the best, but in the next 6 to 10 years, I know the appreciation is going to be there. Gentrification may be there where I have better renters and the neighborhood is going to be better. And so the city is putting money into this neighborhood. And so that's why the criteria and the numbers all have to be a holistic equation of what I'm looking at because the numbers may not always matter from a cash flow standpoint.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, you have to kind of build in like, what am I willing to kind of sacrifice now to gain, in the future? And I feel like that's hard, right? I think you always find the best deals in neighborhoods that are up and coming, but then you also are like, okay, well then I have to live in an up and coming neighborhood. But then you always like, yeah, the upside is always there. That's awesome. That's really
Yeah.
cool. And I want to end this off before giving you kind of a chance to, pitch anything else that you may have. But I want to know what is your like worst story? Like, what's your crazy horror story? And then what would you say is your best moment?
Okay. I'll start with the horror story.
Okay.
So horror story is probably um I had a Section 8 tenant who was a tenant that I was brought into. So when I purchased the building, there was a tenant that was already in the building, right? So that particular tenant was causing mayhem. They didn't follow the rules. They just thought they were, the hottest thing from since sliced bread. And so I'm like, what is going on? And so part of what I said earlier is sometimes you come to situations where the landlord probably wasn't present. So the tenants can oftentimes do whatever they wanted to do. And then when you get somebody not only living in the property, but somebody who is also changing the rules, they don't like that because you're essentially changing their lifestyle to how you want things to be, right? And it's not like I'm doing crazy things. It's just I want to contribute to a neighborhood that's more positive, that's better. So what I ran into is somebody who was very familiar with Section 8 laws. And so what that meant was they would falsify information to send to Section 8 where I eventually stopped getting paid rent from that program. And they refused to move out. So not only was I not getting paid rent, they refused to move out and I had to go through an eviction process. So that was just a nightmare because it was dragging on and on while they were still living here. We're still going to court. And Chicago's court system is not something quick. You're waiting months for things to happen. And so that was just it was a nasty interaction. And so something like that just showed me one, what kind of tenants I want to be clear of how I'm screening. and the other is, you know, understanding how you come into a place and change things and give them the opportunity to jump ship early, instead of letting them stay, right? Because I think
Yeah.
what exacerbated it is that I allowed them to stay knowing that they weren't going to abide by the rules and whatnot. So I would say that was one of the horror stories. The positive from that is, and I don't advise anyone. So I'm very informed, and I very much like to read and find out information. I was my own legal lawyer during the court case the entire
Oh
time.
wow.
So I ended up winning to some, I would say win. So the tenant owed a back pay of about $3,500. I got over half of that, based on the case and coming to agreement. So I eventually settled with their, because they had a legal aid,
Yeah.
because they had government assistance, and so the legal aid knew they were losing, because like I had documentation of what they were doing, what the tenant refused to abide by, and so I ended up getting a good amount of my money from that tenant. I still lost some, but I was like, is I rather stop the case now because it's more of a headache, right? I can only do so much research on how to
Yeah.
write legal documents and whatnot, and so we just stopped it there. But at least I got some of my money from the work that I did on that. So I would say
Man,
that.
yeah, your own lawyer. That's intense. Yeah, I feel like squatters and like eviction stuff. It's like the only thing that always like gives me pause when it comes to renting out anything. But of course, on the flip side, I gotta know. What's your like best story? Your positive one. You're like, oh, this makes it all worth it. Like, what's that story?
I would say it's real estate is also a game that it depends on how hungry you are.
Yeah,
So, two of the properties that I purchased on my own, the first one I purchased with my VA, when I talked about the cash flow is pretty good. The seller was not trying to, not the seller, but the selling agent was not trying to respond to anybody's buying agent, was not trying to follow up, was not doing showings. So I was working with a selling agent or a buying agent myself, right? Somebody who's helping me look for a property, somebody who's identifying places that I can go, take a look at that may fit my criteria. They weren't doing their due diligence, right? So I was like, can you follow up? Can you follow up? Because the numbers made sense on this property. When I ran the numbers, I'm like, oh, this can cash flow. Because they were selling it as a 3 unit, but there was a fourth unit in there that wasn't, unless you read the description and looked at the pictures, you wouldn't know there was a fourth unit. And so
yeah,
I was like, it was a hidden gem. And so I'm like, we need to get on this. So my first agent wasn't doing the legwork that I needed. I needed them to be hungry. If I'm hungry, I need you to act the same. So I went on Redfin, and you can reach out on Redfin. They're like, we'll
yeah.
connect you to an agent. So I did that, and then I got an agent. They weren't doing the legwork. And then I went to one more site where it's like Zillow or something like that. I reached out to an agent. I said, I want to see this unit. They reached out to me. They eventually got in contact with the selling agent. And I'm like, yes. I'm like, this person is going to do it. And so I'm like, I'm still talking to the other two agents, mind you. And so
Yeah.
they're not giving me any update. They're saying they're not receiving anything. Cool. And so the success of that story is partly because I was willing to put in the legwork to be able to get this property. And so eventually that third agent was able to get us a showing. I spoke to the seller. They were on site, and we made a deal. And so don't get me wrong, like this, the third agent didn't really do any work. They got in contact and followed the process that was like reach out to the selling agent. But I was really the one who was like, hey, I know this is the one, get in contact with them ASAP. And so they didn't have to give me any other properties to look at. And so, but for me, it was like the work you put into real estate will also have a return for you. Be that if you're doing flips and renovations, or be that you're finding that property that is not doing showings and the agent is trash. Like if you do the legwork to make it happen, it'll work. And so that's why I keep that property in my portfolio now, and it's one of the nicer neighborhoods that I like. Um, be based on the numbers and just the neighborhood itself. And so, I'm glad I did that work to be able to do that.
Yeah.
And I did that with another one of my properties too. So, being able to really hustle in this type of environment, thoughtfully hustle. Don't just hustle
Yeah.
to move things, you know what I mean? But thoughtfully hustle in a way that's very creative and strategic. I've been happy to be a part of that. So yeah.
Yeah, I love that. I love that you left us off with that because, like you said, it's you get out the work that you put in, and so it's like if you're gonna go into long-term rentals, short-term rentals, whatever, don't expect it to just come to you and somebody to handhold you. You got to do a little work on your own. But Quincy, first of all, thank you so much. I first of all, love learning about this. This was awesome. Is there anything else that you want people to know, or anything that you want to say prior for us signing off?
Yeah, I would definitely. It's two things. I would say if you're interested in real estate, just do it. I think it's one of those things where you have to get your feet wet, and it's one of those things you also have to just to some extent learn along the process. Don't get me wrong. Don't go in and say, "Hey, just take my money and give me anything." But just do it. Just do it. I would
Yeah.
say that, and I would say if anyone's interested in learning more, partnering, or just talking about real estate, I'm always open to connecting. In Chicago, they can reach out to me on LinkedIn, Quincy Mingo. On LinkedIn, you could just look me up. Hopefully, you can see my name across.
Yeah,
But
yeah, I
yeah,
got you.
just reach out to me, and I'm down to always talk or connect about real estate. Period.
Appreciate that. Thank you so much. Yeah, I will put his information in the description so you can reach out if you have any questions. But Quincy, thank you again. This was so insightful. And if I end up buying some property, which we're hoping to do in the next like 5 years, an additional place, I'm gonna hit you up.
Definitely do, and I appreciate you having me on the show today. So thank you.
Thank you. All right. Take care.